One, thanks, Sam, for that great introduction there. So my name is Mitch Bewick. So I always say Bewick like the car. It's a good way of saying that. So I am fortunate enough to work for Accessibility Services, and part of my main role is supporting individuals with work integrated learning, but also graduate students. And so I'm excited to be sharing our content today and what we can provide graduate students who are registered with our office, and we'll talk a little bit about those processes as well. So yeah, without further ado, we'll get started. So I will ask, to hold all questions until the end. You feel free to put it in the chat as well. I won't likely be able to get to it until the very end. And so we'll kind of have a time at the end to be able to address those questions. And as Sam said, we will be recording the presentation and it will be made available afterwards as well. Just with the questions, I will also be including my email address at the very end. So if individuals are more comfortable sending me an email afterwards, by all means, any way you can get in contact with me, I'm happy to support any questions that you might have. Just as a quick agenda of what we're going to be covering today, part of the development of the resources we have for graduate students really came out of an identification of what the challenges are, what are unique to graduate students. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about what grad students have or they need in this process and what accessibility services needs to be able to support accommodation planning. We'll talk a little bit about the process as well. So what does it look like for students who might have had accommodations previously? How did they still register with our office? How can we look at providing accommodation supports for individuals that may not have documentation as well? So we'll talk about that process and how you can get connected with our office. I will also be spending a little bit of time referencing the student academic accommodation guidelines. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and the great resources that has for students, faculty, everyone here at the University of Waterloo regarding the roles and responsibilities and how accommodations can be facilitated as well. And then we'll quickly, obviously, recap a little bit of the key messages and encourage students to reach out if they have any questions ultimately as well. And then we'll take some time to any questions that people might have. Kind of use the rest of the time that we have for that. Okay. Okay. So the challenges. So as we acknowledge, accommodating graduate students can be very complex, and there's lots of different aspects that go into a graduate career. Recent literature has supported that the needs of this population have increased, as well as, when you couple that with the increased demands that's placed on students, we're always looking at different ways to be able to support graduate students in all facets of their academic career as well. As we know, of course, the educational environment for graduate students as well extends beyond the classroom. So we do have, course-based accommodations, but we also acknowledge that a lot of the learning and a lot of the degree requirements may not be in the course per se. They might be engaged with research. They might be practicums, fieldwork experiences as well. So we're acknowledging that with the diversity and what the learning experience is for students, so too do the accommodation plans need to be diverse and be able to address those needs as well. So it certainly expands beyond just the classroom, but including any milestones and any other non-course-based degree requirements as well. The other complexity that we acknowledge is some of the challenges is with accommodations for students as well as for employees. So oftentimes students may be utilizing facilities both as a student, but both as an employee of the University of Waterloo. So what does that look like? How is our office involved? How can we help facilitate that as well? Just quickly, obviously, we acknowledge that for individuals that are looking for accommodation supports as their role as a student, they would come to our office. For accommodations for things such as TA, RA, any other deliverables that are basically in the eyes of the university or an employee, that would be pursued through occupational health. So again, working together with that office, we often work collaboratively with the student to see how we can best support the student as well. So that sometimes is a little complex as well. The other thing we acknowledge is accommodations can pose progression delays and may have implications on funding and deliverables as well. So that can also, make it a little bit more challenging to be able to support the student as well as abiding by, what are the degree requirements, what are the timelines, put forward by the department, and how can we, when possible, have some flexibility with that. And what does that mean for funding? What does that mean for the deliverables and timelines as well? So there's always a bit of pressures from both sides. We're acknowledging the department might have some pressures on students need to develop, the thesis, have this by this deadline. We're in fact acknowledging that there might be some flexibility that's needed with that. So kind of working with all stakeholders there to work around those challenges as well. As well as, many students are unaware that accommodations are possible, and it only are referred to us once in crisis. And we say crisis when oftentimes there comes a final deadline that's imposed by the department, and it hasn't come to light that a student might actually have a disability and might actually require accommodation support. So again, in those situations, we're always acknowledging what can we do in that moment, what can we plan short term, how can we plan long term to help support the students in having equal access to their education. This is the purpose of what our accommodations can provide students as well. So, and in my role, speaking a lot with graduate students and undergraduate students as well, it's interesting to hear the perception that accommodations, either from the student perception, may not be appropriate in grad school, or they don't feel as though they um, should be pursuing that or should need to as well. So oftentimes it's breaking down the stigma and acknowledging that, you know, the the deliverables might change and the expectations might change from undergraduate to graduate level schooling, but the accommodation supports do not, right? They do continue. So sometimes it's breaking down that stigma, and that's kind of awareness piece in terms of our accommodations available. And some students finding aren't quite utilizing this to the full potential. And also, as well as many students may, or students in departments may also self-manage their accommodations, which can be problematic as well. So we know as Accessibility Services, we are the university's centralized office to handling all student academic accommodations. So to formalize it, we always recommend students connect with our office, departments connect with our office, so that we can create a formal plan that is easy to follow, and all stakeholders are on the same level. Oftentimes we see this um, situation where students and departments may piece it together over time, not formally going through our office, but acknowledging that there might be some, accommodations or considerations that might be applied there. So we always find it's sometimes a little challenging to navigate those as well. So yeah. So those are some of the challenges. So from that, well, what are the needs that we are trying to provide students? What do we need as an office? What do students need? So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Accommodations for each course and milestone need to be explored on a case-by-case basis. So as we talked about, not only are accommodations available for courses, but also all our milestones as well. And so we really want to have a unique approach for each deliverable. So it's not a one-size-fits-all picture. So for graduate, the deliverables are very different. They're very unique. So they build off one another. And so the accommodation plan for one deliverable or one milestone may not be appropriate for the next milestone. And so that's why we always encourage students to connect with our office regularly to have a discussion. Okay, what are your needs at this moment in time? How have they changed? Have they changed? What is the next deliverable? What are the expectations? What are your concerns there? So we always try to have a unique approach and a fresh perspective going into each deliverable and considering how the accommodation plan can best support your needs at that time. The academic unit, so this includes professors, instructors, or supervisor for graduate thesis support work as well. They need to be involved in determining the types of accommodations that may be appropriate. So the way I always explain this is our office is, in a sense, a really great resource for both students, but also faculty and staff in helping us have the conversation of what is that duty to accommodate. We know there is a legal duty to accommodate. Have we met that? What is appropriate? So we oftentimes try to brainstorm with the student, but as well as with the academic unit. What is appropriate in relation to this deliverable? What are the essential components of the course? What are the essential components of this milestone in terms of what you need the student to demonstrate in order to be able to be assessed to have this, the degree requirements necessary to graduate? So our accommodations, we're not able to override those, of course, right? Students need to be able to demonstrate those. But oftentimes the departments are really good resources in saying, okay, we can't do this, but what about this? And how can we allow students to demonstrate their knowledge in perhaps a different way, have a little bit more flexibility, for example, in how the deliverable is ultimately, executed. So that communication is really important for us. We rely on them. They are the subject matter expertise in that area. So we rely on that input as well as we obviously can provide our input in terms of that duty to accommodate and how we met that threshold as well. So that ongoing communication is really big. The implications of the accommodation on the student's progression and funding need to be considered. So again, this is something that a lot of students aren't quite aware of. So again, sometimes students may require a reduced course load as an example. And so what does that mean as a graduate student for funding? What does that mean for international students, right? What does that mean for your status here as a Canadian citizen studying full-time? Oftentimes work permits may be, or study permits may be related to course load. So these are often other variables that are part of the conversation that is needed with graduate students as well. So we always want students to be able to make an informed decision on, okay, this is what the accommodation plan is. We're recognizing this is based on the needs of the student right now. What does that mean for funding? What does that mean for progression in the program and maybe extending the timeline? So making sure students are aware and that full kind of disclosure of what that means. So that's a big need as well in that conversation. Again, hinting at this is a major trend that we're always talking about is that collaboration between, either GSPA, occupational health, like I talked about, for facilitating employee accommodations and what that might look like, how we can be a resource and kind of do a warm handoff and referral to those processes. The academic unit as well as us. So we're always encouraging open and honest, transparent communication with all stakeholders. When we are communicating with our campus partners, again, we are never disclosing personal or diagnostic information as well. We will never include that information. When we do communicate with stakeholders, it is only to disclose that you are registered with our office and that you're eligible for accommodation supports. That's as far as our communication will go. So that communication is still sometimes really important to be able to help facilitate other aspects of the accommodation plan. Maybe it's connecting with counseling services or health services to get supports in that regard, or maybe it's connecting with the Writing and Communication Center or with GSBA acknowledgement of what that means for their health plan, for example. So we're always working closely with our campus partners, and that is a really good process to help seamlessly provide support for the student. We always like to acknowledge that we encourage students to reach out to our office at any point. And we always say there's no door is the wrong door. So even if you come to our office and it's not per se an accessibility or an accommodation issue or concern, we have no problem referring you to those campus partners and being able to rely on that knowledge that we have as well. So same thing and vice versa with our campus partners. We trust that they are referring students to our office when they need to as well. So, as well as, of course, who doesn't appreciate this, but easy access to consistent accessibility services staff. So part of the thing that I love about my role is being able to work with different departments and have a kind of more knowledge around the graduate world. And being a former grad student myself, I can appreciate and understand the student lived experience and also have that in-depth knowledge around what does accommodation plans look like for graduate world as well. So when students reach out to our office, the primary point of contact will be me and connecting with me in terms of supporting them through their registration process, through our planning process, and what that looks like. So we have a familiar and consistent face as well that we always strive to be able to provide when possible. Okay. So the process, so the next part I want to talk a little bit about is what does the process look like when students are considering, registering with our office or considering connecting with our office in some way? So I want to take a little bit of time to review that as well. So overall, of course, AAS Accessibility Services, we strive to design holistic academic accommodation plans that consider the graduate context and includes the academic unit as a key collaborator. The process overall includes students first and foremost would be expected to register with our office. So there is a process where students can, upload any documentation that they might have pre-existing. If students do not have documentation, they can still register with our office. Students would pursue the pathway of what would be called a suspected disability. So students may not have any formal diagnosis or formal medical, assessments or treatments that might formally identify a disability or a diagnosis, but students can still, fill out the self-suspected screener and connect with our office that way. So we're still able to connect with students even if they don't have that documentation. We're able to help support them for an onboarding appointment, get them registered, get them familiar with what our resources are, but also help them connect with the appropriate resource to get that assessment, to get that updated documentation, to help support long-term accommodation eligibility as well. So if that is a deterrent, we're always encouraging students, do not let that prevent you from registering with our office. If you don't have anything, hey, let's talk, let's see what we can provide with some support at the time being. So the registration appointment is the first step that students are usually in contact with our office to help us to kind of matriculate them into our system and help inform them of the supports and resources that we do have. The next appointment would be, and I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about this, but then we have a planning appointment, which basically involves looking at what are the what are the upcoming milestones? What are the upcoming deliverables that we are specifically talking about? And so we kind of plan directly related to those needs. And then followed by the collaborative meeting as well. And so this usually involves including stakeholders such as supervisors, such as instructors if need to be able to discuss the appropriateness of this plan and where we're moving forward as well. So just like I talked about, I will now provide a little bit more detail about these appointments themselves, just have a better idea. So the registration appointment, as I talked about, is usually the first point of contact where students will connect with our office. The goal is to ultimately understand more information about the student. My goal is always to learn a little bit more about them. What are their motivations? What brought them here? But also information about their program. So this includes obviously discussing student information. So this might be, like I talked about, motivations, interests, what brought them to the University of Waterloo? Where are they hoping to go with this? I'm always interested to see what career aspirations they have as well. That always kind of helps kind of contextualize the students' motivations as well. This also includes, acknowledging, where are the students' strengths? What are the aspects of the program that are going well for them? And then conversely, what are the aspects that aren't going so well? So where are those areas that we might look at supporting more directly? And so where are those areas of weakness perhaps? And this might also include, reviewing any medical documentation that was provided to ultimately determine, the disability status and what kind of supports can be provided there. But it's ultimately learning a little bit more about the student, their lived experience, and ultimately the rationale for connecting with their office. So it's a really good way for us to establish some rapport early on. Of course, we want to learn about the student, but we also want to learn a little bit more about the specific program or the departments and information about that. So what is your program? Is it a course-based master's? Is it a research-based master's? Is it a PhD? Tell me a little bit about where you are in the program. So what are your deliverables left? How many courses do you have left? What is your next upcoming milestone? So if you have a thesis proposal, what is that? So it just allows us to provide a little bit more information about the program itself, the length, where they're at in the program, as well as information such as funding. So how are they being funded? Are they receiving scholarships? Are they receiving, TA-ships or any other kind of funding support that might be provided as well? And this includes, provincial and federal funding, such as the Ontario Student Assistance Program or OSAP. So again, just understanding where the student is, what is their program, what are the unique deliverables associated, the expectations with that program itself. That also helps. Discussing existing or previous accommodations. So if students have come to our office and they have formally identified as a student with a disability, perhaps at another university, what did that accommodation plan look like? What did you find was helpful? What did you find maybe was not helpful? And it's a way for us to understand where those needs are and what ultimately we can provide at the University of Waterloo as well. Also, sometimes students, as we talked about, may be self-managing their accommodations. So are there kind of informal accommodation arrangements that have already been made with the department? Are you already on an extension for, this deliverable? What is the timeline? So just to get a bit of an idea of where we're at right now, what kind of supports have already been provided, either formally or informally, if that's appropriate as well. And of course, the registration appointment also talks about, what referrals we can make to our office already. So part of our office, we have the consulting side, but we also have the services side. And so services for a lot of our students looks like a learning strategy as well as adaptive assistive technology. So those resources play a big part in what students have access to in terms of their graduate experience as well. So learning strategy is really important for helping students to understand things like test writing strategies, study strategies, note taking, whether it's tips and tricks of how to organize your thesis, how to organize your paper. And a lot of these skills are specifically addressed to the graduate context as well. So these skills are obviously transferable. They apply to all different aspects of our academics, but we do have specific resources and learning strategy contact to be able to address these as they pertain specifically to the graduate world and the unique demands that they have as well. Also with that, like I talked about, the assistive technology might also be part of that as well. So our office helps support students that might require or could even benefit from, adaptive technology such as audio recording. How can that be utilized? How can that be integrated as part of your academic skills? How can programs such as, dictation software or anything like that be utilized to help support students in being able to write their papers in a more efficient way that's conducive to what their needs are as well. So these two supports are also part of that registration appointment. and informing students how they can engage with those resources, what kind of workshops are available that they can sign up for, how they can connect with those resources virtually online right now, and get the most out of their experience with our office as well. Okay, so after the registration appointments, what we would look for, so the registration appointment is applicable for all graduate students. So that would always be the first point of contact, even if they're in a course-based program or in a research or PhD program as well. That would be the first point of contact. The next point, so for individuals that are engaging in those milestones, so those non-course deliverables, what we usually encourage is to have an accommodation planning appointment. And so this allows us to be able to understand what the upcoming milestone is and develop a strategy for that specifically. So again, like we talked about, this experience for the students is unique to each deliverable. So we always encourage students to reach out to our office for each milestone that they are requesting accommodation support in. So it might start with the thesis proposal, but then after that, it might actually consist of the actual completion of the thesis itself and what kind of supports can be provided. What are the main barriers for you and what kind of supports we can provide there. So like I talked about, the purpose is obviously to discuss the upcoming milestone and kind of make sure the conversation is geared towards how are the supports intended to support you with that specific milestone? What are the unique barriers and unique deliverables that are expected with that? Part of that conversation exploring what kind of accommodations might be required. So it might be part of the accommodation plan, like we talked about, might be connecting you with our learning strategist. And so that might be built into the accommodation plan to work with our learning strategist, develop a work back plan in terms of identifying what might be a more feasible timeline for you register with our office and what you might need to be able to meet that deadline. And that can be then presented to the academic unit as well. We might be exploring different ways in which the deliverable can be performed. Maybe there's other variables that we can look at, a little bit more flexibility with the timeline, but also how it's presented and how it's delivered as well. So it's really unique to each situation, and it's really about what are the main barriers and how can we address those, being creative in each situation if we need to. Of course, as we talked about, a big pattern is discussing the relevant stakeholders. So whenever we are discussing what an accommodation plan looks like, we're never doing that in isolation. So it always starts with the student and myself talking about who might need to be involved in this. So we talked about what an accommodation plan might look like for this deliverable. But then where do we go from here? Who do we need to include in this? And that might include other campus partners if they need to have input on that, but as well as identifying, supervisor, any instructors that might need to be included in that as well, to really enrich that conversation to make sure that we are not, trying to override any essential components of the program, but still allow you to demonstrate that in a flexible way. So discussing the relevant stakeholders is an important step. And of course, determining the action plan and next steps. So that might mean myself reaching out to the academic unit to set up an appointment, a joint appointment between myself, the student, and the supervisor, to then be able to discuss where do we go from here. So the student might have some action items as well in terms of connecting with a learning strategist or connecting with counseling services that might be part of the underlying accommodation supports that are provided as well. So really identifying where do we go from here and who's accountable, what are the roles and responsibilities moving forward. And so the final kind of step in this is the collaboration piece. So like I talked about, once we've identified who needs to be engaged in this process, the next part is to then actually reach out and to seek out that collaboration from the academic unit. And so the goal is to ultimately finalize the accommodation plan for that upcoming milestone. So if we're looking at, in some situations, it might be, okay, the thesis defense is coming up. So obviously that involves completing the actual written thesis itself, having it reviewed, and then ultimately having, let's say, an oral defense, if that's the of your program. So finalizing, what does it look like? What does accommodation plan look like for the oral defense, and who needs to be involved? Who needs to be informed of that? The supervisor, the other committee members that might be on that, the thesis defense itself as well. So we obviously want to discuss the implications of the accommodation. So what that allows the student to be able to do. So are there any concerns with academic integrity? What are the implications of this? And then the student being able to demonstrate their knowledge or their mastery of the content to be appropriate to have the degree rewarded to them at the end, right? Again, we can't override that, but it's around finding flexible and creative ways for the student to be able to demonstrate that in different ways if they need to, as related to their disability. Ultimately finalizing the accommodation plan as well. So this often involves formalizing it, again, with signatures. So we have a document that is then circulated to the student, the academic unit, myself, that everyone will sign off on, and will then get copies of that document as well. And this is another reason why we always recommend students come to us, so that we can formalize it. So there's no concerns of, different parties coming back and saying, oh, I never agreed to this. This was not the accommodation plan, et cetera. So we want to avoid that by having clear, informed consent, everyone signing off that this is the accommodation plan as it is right now. If there need to be revisions made to it, that's fine. We just need to all agree to them and then re-sign the document and circulate that around as well. So part of the feedback that we've got, again, is with some of these situations that haven't panned out so well, and there might be concerns of what the actual accommodation plan was. We really want to try to formalize that so we reduce that stressor down the road, so everyone's on the same page, we know what to expect, there's no uncertainties in the process, and hoping that this really helps streamlines the process for everyone involved. And again, as with anything, determining the next steps, roles and responsibilities. So once we have that identified accommodation plan that's been signed off on, it does acknowledge what the roles are. For the student, obviously, it might be they are expected to then engage with their accommodation plan as it's been outlined. So that might mean connecting with some of our support staff, a learning strategy, utilizing the assistive technology that might be recommended for them, as well as following the prescribed pathways. So if there are deviations that are needed with the plan itself, what are the roles and responsibilities of the academic unit? If they're noticing the student is not making the progress needed, the students are not making the progress, how can they inform us? How can we then revisit this conversation? So it's always about what are the expectations, and how can we make sure everyone's on the same page as well. One thing I do want to mention is with these three processes, so I talked about the registration appointment, the planning appointment, and the collaboration appointment. It is important to note that these aren't always distinct three separate appointments. We break them down this way in that some cases that is warranted, but in other cases, a student might be able to meet with me. We might be able to do the registration appointment as well as begin to plan for a milestone in the same appointment. And so that's not always viewed as separate appointments. It might be, and we might need to do that depending on the complexity and the amount of conversation that we need. But that isn't always the case as well as with the collaboration point as well. What we often do is we can reach out to the academic unit and present them with the proposed accommodation plan. If the proposed accommodation plan is fine as it is, then that ultimately services as the collaboration meeting itself. So sometimes we don't need to also formally meet. We often recommend it, but if it's not needed, then that's fine as well. So just a bit of a context there. It's not always three distinct meetings. The other point we always want to mention is that this is very cyclical in nature, meaning students might with their office as the first point, but the planning and collaboration appointments can happen in really, they can repeat as well. So we might do a planning appointment and then ultimately have it signed off for one deliverable, but then we might need to revisit the planning because something's changed, and that's fine as well. So students can cycle through these appointments as they need to and get that resource. So it's not sequential necessarily, it is ongoing and it's fluid depending on what the student needs as well. Okay, so moving on to the student academic accommodation guidelines. So I do also want to share a little bit of information about this. So this is a document that can be found on the UWaterloo Secretariat website, but also it can be linked through our Accessibility Services homepage. And so in alignment with the University of Waterloo's ongoing commitment to upholding the rights of persons with disabilities and also creating accessible and inclusive learning environments for all, this document serves as a guide on how best to support students with disabilities and other accommodations that also maintain academic integrity and standards. So it is a document that is very useful not only for staff and faculty, but students as well. So this acknowledges the procedural guidance for staff in terms of establishing accommodation plans. So what are the roles and responsibilities of the students? What are the roles and responsibilities of the department and the faculty and staff members as well? It also talks about the dispute resolution process. So if that comes down to perhaps there's a dispute between the accessibility services and the department, what is the process for that? If there's a dispute between the student and accessibility services in terms of what they feel their accommodation plan should be, again, this is all formally outlined. We always try to be transparent that yes, there is a pathway for this. If you're not happy, talk to someone, let us know, give us feedback and ways that we can engage in this process, either informally or formally as well. As well as it talks about retroactive accommodation processes. So as much as we always strive to be as proactive as possible and like to plan ahead, and have these accommodation plans identified. We know that always isn't the case, and sometimes life happens and throws a curveball at us. So if something happens where students are coming to us after the fact, so after a course is over, perhaps, what are the processes in place for students to be able to still explore potential supports available to them on disability grounds? So what are the formal processes in place for students? What are the informal processes? So maybe it's still during a course and a deliverable is passed, but students might feel as though they weren't provided with accommodations that they would have been eligible for. So how can we then support students in ensuring that that is rectified and students are provided with their accommodation? So again, this document is a very valuable document in providing that information. In that document, there's also numerous appendices that contain really helpful information on, defining what are reasonable accommodations, what are the essential requirements. So you've heard me talk a little bit about, those essential requirements of courses, of milestones. And so this is good questions for students and staff and faculty to be able to put forward when they're considering an accommodation plan. And we often hear a lot around, undue hardship. What does that mean? And what is the definitions of that as well? And how is that used to create an accommodation plan as well? So as well as defining documentation requirements as well, and the pathway for that. So what we would be looking for in terms of medical documentation, what information we would look to have included in that to help inform accommodation plans as well. It also talks a little bit about the timeline requirements to facilitate accommodations as well. So acknowledging that depending on the nature of the request and getting documentation, there might need to be considerations made to the timeline and what that means for accommodation planning, what that means for progression and stuff like that as well. It also does talk about protecting personal health information as well in terms of the information remains confidential with us. It also talks a little bit about how tips and tricks for staff and faculty members to also refer students to accessibility services as well. So that's, again, another big guiding point that we recommend individuals read over. So I have put the link here as well, but again, you can simply search Student Academic Accommodation Guidelines, University of Waterloo. And that document will come right up, and that is something that is a really valuable resource that we're always recommending all campus partners, everyone associated with the University of Waterloo, to read over and review, as it does contain a lot of really valuable information for students and staff. Okay, and then so the final kind of key messages here that I always want to kind of revisit is, first and foremost, accommodation support is available for graduate students for all academic components, so courses and milestones. So like I said, that is one of the biggest kind of misconceptions that I've been trying to challenge in my role as students come to us and saying, oh, I didn't know, accommodations were even available for graduate students. And so just, again, putting that message out there that we have developed thoroughly our resources and our knowledge of how we can provide a graduate accommodation supports for students. Again, students can register with accessibility services at any time with or without formal documentation. So there's no cutoff period in a term, and we will accept any registration, any documentation at any point during the year. It doesn't matter. And again, if students do not have formal documentation, that is okay. You can still register with our office as a suspected student at that point, and we can still work with you to develop an interim accommodation plan with the expectation that we'd be helping you to get that information, to get an assessment, to get connected with healthcare teams, and ultimately provide us with that information that we would need to create a more fulsome, tailored accommodation plan long-term. So please do not let that deter students. Again, feel free to reach out and see what that process is like and have that conversation and what supports we can provide. Also, students, I always like to acknowledge that students are ultimately in the driver's seat of when they would like to engage their accommodation plan. So oftentimes students will indicate to me, well, if I register, do I always have to have my accommodations? Absolutely not. So students may require accommodation supports for a couple courses, may not be for all courses, or they might need accommodation supports for one milestone, but not every milestone. That's okay. Students are expected to identify those needs as they come up, and we can work with them as they need to. But there's no obligation or expectations for students to continue to work with our office if they don't feel as though they need to. So that is something that we want students to be aware of. They have that autonomy, they have that control, and how we communicate that to the academic unit if we need to as well. And ultimately, if there's nothing else, help is always available. Reach out with any questions you might have. So you can contact our email there, access@uwaterloo.ca, for more general inquiries, and phone number there as well. But we're always here to help support students. we always expect students to let their needs be known. So if there is something we can do, let us know, and we can take it from there and help work with you and the academic unit to provide any support that might be needed as well. Okay. That is about it. So that is everything I wanted to cover today. I know there's a lot of information. I have put my email address up here as well. So anyone that wants to email me directly with a question, by all means, send me an email at any time. I'm happy to field those questions. I'm happy to set up a time to meet with you as well. So I'll end it there. Of course, I'll kind of open it up if anyone has any questions at all at this point. Right now, I'm happy to answer those. If not, we'll move forward with individuals that want to email me as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mitch, for that very informative presentation. And in fact, I was actually scribbling some notes for myself too, because of course, in my capacity, I'm sure Leah was as well, in my capacity as a student wellness coordinator, it's always helpful to stay up to date with regards to the process. And it certainly helps you've helped shed a lot of light on some of the complexities that are unique to a graduate student in going through the accommodation process and what that looks like and all of the different parties involved. So we very much appreciate you taking the time. As Mitch mentioned, if anybody has any questions that they want to put into the chat or they want to ask Mitch directly, that's certainly not a problem at all. He's opened up that if anybody has any particular questions that they might want to address that's not on the video, you can do so by reaching out to his email address there at the bottom. And thank you again for providing that, Mitch. We'll give it a couple of seconds just to see if any of the few attendees here have any questions that they would like to ask. And then I'm going to open up the floor to a representative from our Graduate Student Association in MME, Ben McCollum, to do a brief presentation about some opportunities that are available for graduate students as well. So we'll give it a couple of seconds. It's okay if there's might not be a few questions now, but hopefully if there are any burning questions, connect with Mitch directly via email, or you can connect with the larger accessibility services team at access@uwaterloo.ca. Fantastic email address that you folks locked down there.
If I may, Mitch, I just wanted to mention I really appreciate you mentioning the fact about how students can register with accessibility in a retroactive sense. I know with COVID, there's, like you said, sometimes life can throw you curveballs. COVID would definitely be one of those curveballs. And people have been impacted in all kinds of different ways, whether it be themselves or being at home with a family member that maybe has tested positive. So thank you for mentioning that, because like as you said, I think a lot of students don't think, oh, it's too late in the term, I can't register with accessibility, or this circumstance that I'm living in doesn't qualify. And I think, like you said, it's important that students just do the registration, get their information to you, talk to you, and then the determination can be made from there, rather than just assuming at the outset that, it's not gonna work out. So thank you for mentioning that.
Absolutely, and we're always mindful of, we don't try to get hung up on, titles and exactly what that is, but it's more about how is this impacting you? How is this impacting you? How is this creating barriers for you as well? And so we're acknowledging how we can provide support there. And some of it might be, not necessarily related directly to their academics. Like we talked about, COVID is a big contributor to students that might have pre-existing disabilities or conditions as well, exacerbating that. So we're acknowledging that. So we always want to be flexible in what we can provide. And so we always encourage students to reach out. Absolutely.
Perfect, thank you.
And I think that's a point that's worth emphasizing, is that even if you suspect that there might be an impact or something, there's no harm in asking. There's no harm in connecting with the team at Accessibility Services. There's certainly no judgment or anything like that with regards to what you're going through. They're a fantastic service that's here to help. And even if you suspect that you might have something or that you might have a rationale or a reason, please do consider meeting with them just to even have that confidential conversation about what might be applicable to you.
Yeah, and yeah, keyword being confidential as well. So oftentimes students might register with our office and nothing further gets communicated to the academic unit, and that's fine. If students want to still connect with our office, still engage with some of the resources that we have, I almost say behind the scenes. So there's no formal identification of their registration, and if students are comfortable at that level first, Absolutely, right? And so we always encourage them to connect with us if they're concerned about those. Let's have a conversation and go from there.
Awesome. All right, thank you so much, Mitch. And Ben, if you're still with us here, happy to have you share some information with regards to the fine group at Mega.
Great.
Sure.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thanks so much, Sam and Leah, for having me back. Final time to tell some folks about some upcoming events that Mega is hosting. I decided to have my background contrast Mitch's snowy campus a little bit. So I'll just share my screen here with you. Perfect. So first of all, I just want to remind everyone listening, watching the presentation, not just from the MME department front, but anyone across campus, that Mega is hosting a research symposium on March 17th, and we're having graduate students from the MME department in PhD, MASC, or MEng programs to come and present some of their research work, either as a long form presentation or as a poster. So anyone at the MME department as a grad student is still welcome to submit a poster up until March 14th and be eligible for a $100 Best Poster Award during the event. And also, we're happy to offer all presenters a free Uber Eats meal voucher this year in place of an in-person lunch offering. So outside of the MME department, we're also welcoming anyone from the university community to attend this great event, including students, faculty, and staff. And all presenters will be able to attend for the whole day and watch some great presentations from the MME graduate students. And second, I just want to mention another upcoming event next week, which is our monthly coffee chat that Mega hosts. We'll be having a short session where anyone from across the university can come and chat with fellow students, and also join in on a fun drawing game where we offer some great Amazon gift card prizes. So that is on Friday, March 12th at 1 p.m. And if anyone has any questions about that event, or is looking to register, you can find that link on our website, at the webpage at the U Waterloo website. And finally, I just want to quickly put up some of our contacts. So Mega can be contacted at our email, and you can also connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, and our newly updated webpage, as well as I mentioned at the uwaterloo.ca website. You can find all the information about our events, including links to register and to attend our research symposium on the 17th. And with that, I'll hand it back to Sam. So thanks so much again for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. And once again, a huge thanks to Mitch from Accessibility Services for his great informative presentation there. As mentioned before, we will, once everything is finished with uploading, we will upload this video to our YouTube channel and advertise it widely to our graduate student community as well. So I'd just like to thank everyone for your time today, and thank you for being with us. And again, if you have any questions directly for Mitch or even for Ben as well from Mega, you can connect with both of them directly. And yeah, thank you. So this concludes our 5 weeks of wellness series. It's been a been a long journey, but it's been a fun one. We've got a lot of great guest speakers again, and we very much look forward to hopefully doing this again in the future as well.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.